This is a story for everybody, but I really have to dedicate it to my dear friend Aaron, who is kind of fond of it. It's called Assipattle and the Stoorworm. Now, there was once a farmer who lived on a fine wee farm called Leaguer, and it lay under the side of the hill, and there was a stream that ran down the side of it, and it was a lovely wee place. And the farmer and his wife, they had 7 sons, and they all worked very hard on the farm every day. Well, that's not strictly true. You see, the farmer and his wife and the 6 oldest sons worked hard on the farm, but the youngest son did nothing but lie by the side of the fire raking through the ashes. He became covered in ash, and they called him Assipattle, which just means somebody that lazily rakes through the ashes. Now, his brothers hated him, and they would always give him a kick on their way out to their work and say, "Out of the way, Assipattle." And his parents just shook their heads over him and said, "Boy, boy, boy." But Assipattle didn't care. No, Assipattle was a great storyteller, and in the stories he was always the hero that would kill the dragon and save a princess, and his brothers hated him even more for that. No, one day a terrible thing happened because the Stoorworm arrived at the land where Assipattle lived. This was no ordinary Stoorworm. This was the Master Stoorworm, the biggest and baddest Stoorworm in the sea. What's a Stoorworm? Oh, I should say, shouldn't I? Well, a Stoorworm is a huge sea serpent. And this one was so big, this monster was wrapped right around the world. And when it moved, it caused tidal waves and earthquakes, and it could sweep whole towns and villages into its huge mouth. And sailing ships, well, it just cracked them between the forks of its tongue. It was a monster, and if that wasn't bad enough, its breath was poisonous and killed anything it touched, and it had arrived at the land where Assipattle lived, and it had started to yawn, which was a bad sign, because it didn't mean that it was sleepy. It meant it was hungry and needed to be fed. Well, the king called all his advisors together, and none of them had a clue what to do. But one of them, who was slightly less dense than the rest, said, "I think we should call the spaeman who lives on the side of the mountain. He knows everything." So they sent for the spaeman. Now, a spaeman is basically a wizard. And this spaeman had a robe and a long flowing beard and a staff in his hand, and he said, "Your Majesty, I have made a study of the Stoorworm over the years, and I have to say that it has grown old now, and it's developed a bit of a sweet tooth in its old age. You see, it's been all over the world, and it's eaten all sorts of exotic people. But a sweet tooth is what it has now. So, if you want it to leave your country alone, you have to feed it 7 maidens every Saturday morning for its breakfast. Only by doing this will you save your land from destruction." Well, that was a terrible thing to have to do, but every Saturday morning 7 maidens were bound hand and foot and set on a rock in front of the Stoorworm, and the Stoorworm would yawn 7 great yawns in the morning, and then it would flick out its forked tongue, and it would pick up the girls between the forks of his tongue and eat them like sweeties, like candy. Well, there was one day, one Saturday morning, that Assipattle and his family were there to see the terrible breakfast being eaten, and the old man was saying, "What are we going to do? I mean, there'll soon be no girls left in the whole land, and there'll be nobody to marry my sons. And there'll be no children after us. Who's going to look after us in our old age? And Assipattle said, that's all right, Dad. I'll fight the Stoorworm and kill it. Well, when his brothers heard that, they threw stones at him and drove him away. Now that night, back at Legar, they were sitting around the table, having just about ready to have supper. And the older boys were still out working in the barn. So the mother says to Assipattle, go out to the barn and tell your brothers to come in for their tea. So Assipattle trotted along outside to the barn, and the boys were thrashing oats on the floor. They were beating the grain off the sheaves with a flail. And Assipattle said, "Hey, boys, supper's ready." Well, the oldest one turned a cold eye on Assipattle, and he said, "Get 'em, boys." And they all grabbed him, and they piled straw on top of him, and they all sat on his head, so that it almost smothered him. But the father came out to see what was taking him so long, and when he saw what he was doing, well, he wasn't very happy. He gave them all a big lugget, slap around the head, and sent them packing into the house for their supper. And when they were eating their supper, the old man was still really unhappy about this. It's kind of bad form trying to kill your brother. And so he said, that's really, you bring shame on the family doing things like that. You should leave your brother be. Well, they said, what can you do? What can you expect with a waster like him? And Assipattle said, it's all right, Father. It's okay, Dad. Don't worry about it. If you hadn't come in when you did, then I was just about to give them a good thrashing myself. You, said the oldest son. Aye. You give us a thrashing? Yeah. Well, why didn't you then, if you're so brave and strong? Well, he says, I'm saving my strength, aren't I? You saving your strength? What for? Well, for when I fight the Stoorworm. Well, the old man just shook his head and he said, Son, you'll fight the Stoorworm when I make spoons for the horns of the moon. Now time passed, and more maidens were fed to the monster. And people had enough of this. They were complaining. So the king sent for the spaeman again, and they said, What can you do to get rid of this monster for once and for all? Not just keep it quiet for a while, but to get rid of it completely. Well, said the spaeman, there is one thing that you could do, but, it's too terrible. No, I can't even bring myself to say it. Say it, said the king. I command you, as your king, tell me, what is it? Well, said the spaeman, if you were to feed it the loveliest maiden in the whole land, your daughter, the Princess Chem de Lovely, then it would go away and leave the land in peace. Now all the other courtiers, they all said, Oh, no, your majesty, no. You can't do that. She's your only child, heir to the throne. You can't feed her to a monster. But the king held up his hand for silence, and he said, No, it's only right that my daughter should die so that her people can live. We are descended from the god Odin himself, and it is only right that she should make this sacrifice. But give me one indulgence. Give me 3 weeks to find a brave knight that could fight and kill the Stoorworm. If such a man can be found, he will have my daughter's hand in marriage, my kingdom, and my magic sword, Sickersnapper, which was a gift from the god Odin to my ancestors. So a proclamation went through the land. There was a knight needed to fight and kill the Stoorworm. And the prizes were, as I said, the magic sword, the kingdom, and the princess's hand in marriage. Well, 36 brave knights rode into town, and when the first 12 seen just how big the Stoorworm was, they rode into town, right through the town, out the other side of the town, and ran off home as fast as they could to hide under the bed. The other 12 fainted and had to be carried out boot first on stretchers. And the other 12 just went up to the king's castle, and they sat there, drinking his wine and looking very miserable and not offering to do a thing to help the princess. Well, the old king was disgusted at this. You see, the blood of an older and more noble race flowed through his veins, and he said, "Fetch me my boat. I will fight the monster in the morning and die in the attempt." Well, news of this spread like wildfire through the kingdom. The king was going to fight the monster in the morning. And news had reached Ligar as well, and Assipattle's parents were lying in bed that night, and they'd been talking about it. And the old man was saying, "So the king's going to fight the Stoorworm tomorrow morning. We should go and watch. We should go and see what happens. We'll take my horse, Teetgong, fastest horse in the land. We can ride on it and go and watch the fight." "Hm," said the old woman. "Hm," said the man. "What do you mean? Hm, said his wife. "What's wrong with you? You're awful sort of bad mood tonight." And she says, "Well, so I might." "Why? What's happened?" "I'm not happy with you." "Why? What have I done?" "Well, it's not so much what you've done as what you've not done." "What?" "Well, you're keeping a secret from me, aren't you? You're not telling me things." "I have no secrets from you, my dear." "Yes, you do. You know that horse of yours, Teetgong?" "Yeah, fastest horse in the land," he says. "I know," she says. "But what is it that makes that horse so fast? I mean, there's something that you do that makes that horse run fast. What is it?" "Well, you don't need to know that." "And why not?" "Well, it's sort of it's kind of a secret." "Aha," she says, "and if you've got one secret, you'll probably have more." "No," he says, "I don't have any secrets." So they argue for ages back and forth about this, and in the end, the old man says, "Okay, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what it is that I do. Now, Teetgong, well, you know the name Teetgong means a sudden gust of wind. So the horse is named after the wind because the horse can run as fast as the wind. And when I want it to stand still, I give it a pat on the left shoulder and it stands perfectly still. If I want it to run fast, I give it a pat on the right shoulder and it runs fast. But if I want it to run as fast as the wind, I blow through a goose's thrapple. That's the windpipe of a goose. He said I always keep one in my jacket pocket for emergencies." Well, when the old woman heard that, she was happy, and soon the two of them were snoring away. Now, Assipattle had been lying awake at the side of the fire listening to all of this, and when he was sure that his parents were asleep, he sneaked over to his father's coat, and he took the goose's thrapple out the pocket, and he headed off to the stable. And he came in to where the horse Teetgong was tethered. Now, when Teetgong saw him coming, well, this wasn't his master, and so it started to neigh and rear and kick, but Assipattle just gave it a pat on the left shoulder, and it stood perfectly still. Then he climbed on its back, and he gave it a pat on the right shoulder, and it ran out the door, and it let out a loud neigh as it went, and that woke up the old man and his sons. They went out and they shouted, "Stop, thief!" and they took horses themselves and they rode after Assipattle and Teetgong. Of course, they didn't know it was Assipattle. And they ran after him, and the old man was catching up with Teetgong. and he shouted out, "Hi, hi, ho, Teet Gong, whoa!" and Teet Gong stopped dead in his tracks. But the old man pulled out a goose's thrapple from his jacket pocket, and he blew through it, burp, just like that. And as soon as the horse heard that sound, its ears pricked up, and whew, away it went, as fast as an arrow from a bow, over the countryside, over the hill, and gone from sight. Well, the old man and his sons just turned around and went back home, gave up the horse for lost. And Assipattle rode through the night until he came to a great big bay. And in the bay there was a big black island. Only it wasn't really an island, it was the Stoorworm's head. So he rode down to the shore, and there was a wee cottage sitting there. And he went inside, and the old woman who lived there, she was sound asleep in her box bed with a grey cat curled up at her feet. And the fire had been rested for the night. You see, back in those days, it was considered bad luck to let your fire go out. The luck of the house depended on it. So what they would do at night is just to keep the fire going. They would put damp peats on it, and it would just smoulder away. The turf would just smoulder, and then in the morning, a few puffs of the bellow, a few bits of dry peat on top, and away it went again. Now Assipattle took an iron pot from the side of the fire, and he picked up a peat, and he put it in the pot, a glowing peat. And then he ran out the house, down to the shore, where a guard was standing in the king's boat, ready and waiting for him. "Morning," said Assipattle. "Morning," said the guard. How are you getting on today, then?" "Oh, I'm cold," says the man. "Well, I'll tell you what," says Assipattle. "I was just about to dig a little scoop in the earth here and build a little fire in it to boil some limpets for my breakfast. Would you like to come and join me and have a warm by the fire?" says the man. He's rubbing his hands together, trying to keep warm and trying desperately to stay warm, beating himself. Trying to get that circulation going. And he said, "I'd love to, but I can't leave the boat. The king would give me a good hiding if I'd left my post. No, I have to stay here, or the king's kemperman will beat me black and blue." "Oh, better stay where you are, then," said Assipattle. And he started to scoop in the ground, started to dig like he was making a little scoop for a fire. And he said, "Gold! Gold! I found gold! There's gold here!" As soon as the man heard that, the guard, he was out the boat and ran along like a shot and said, "Gold? Where?" And he pushed Assipattle out the way and he started digging in the dirt like a dog. Assipattle picked up his pot with his peat in it and he ran to the boat. He cast off the rope, hoisted the sail, and was sailing across the bay before the guard even knew he'd been tricked. Well, Assipattle was gliding towards the head of the Stoorworm, and just at that moment the sun appeared above the horizon, and the first rays of that morning sun kissed the Stoorworm's eyes, and the Stoorworm started to wake up. Assipattle could also see that the king and his men had turned up on the beach, and they were not happy. The king was dancing about in rage. Now the Stoorworm started to wake up, and had yawned the first of its 7 yawns in the morning. And Assipattle positioned the boat alongside the Stoorworm's mouth, so when it yawned for a second time, a whole lot of water poured into the Stoorworm's mouth, and Assipattle's boat was pulled in with it, went in right into the Stoorworm's mouth, and right down its throat, down, deep inside the Stoorworm. Now, I don't suppose you know what the inside of a Stoorworm looks like, but I'll tell you. It's just a long tunnel. But every now and again, on both sides, there would be smaller tunnels that would run off this way and that, and some water went gurgling down that way, and some went gurgling down that way, until eventually the water became shallower and shallower and the boat grounded and stopped. Now the whole inside of the Stoorworm glowed with a green phosphorescent glow, so Assipattle could see what he was doing. He took his pot with his peat in it, and he ran and he ran and he better ran, until he found what he was looking for, the Stoorworm's liver. Now, if you ever heard of cod liver oil, you get it in capsules. People take it because it's good for them. And there's a lot of oil in a fish's liver. So imagine how much oil there would be in the Stoorworm's liver. It was huge, like a mountain. So Assipattle took out his knife and he cut a hole in the Stoorworm's liver and he put the burning peat into that hole. And he blew and he blew and he better blew on that peat until it started to splutter and flame up, and it set fire to the oil in the Stoorworm's liver, and then Assipattle turned around and ran back to the boat as fast as his legs would carry him. Now, meanwhile, the king was having a bad day. I mean, to start with, he had to get up really early in the morning to go and fight the monster, and, I'm not a morning person, so that would put me in a bad mood. But then he had to go and fight a monster and, and face certain death, and it wasn't good. And then, when he turned up, what should he see? Some idiot steal his boat, sail across the bay, and get swallowed by the monster. Oh, great. Oh, it just doesn't get any better than that, does it? So he's stomping around in a huff on the shore, when one of his men says, Your Majesty. What? I've never seen the Stoorworm do that before. Do what? Well, he's sort of, he's kind of, he's sort of, smoking. Smoking? What do you mean, smoking? Well, look. And sure enough, he pointed towards the monster, and the king looked, and there was black smoke coming out of the monster's nostrils and out of his mouth, and it was starting to look very unwell. And sure enough, the Stoorworm was starting to feel very sick indeed. He was thinking he shouldn't have had that last maiden. It didn't agree with him. And he started to feel sick, and he started to retch. And he went, Bah! And he spewed up all the water that was inside him. And when the king and his men and the old woman and her cat that came out to see what was going on, when they saw this huge wave coming towards them of water, they ran up the hill to safety. And on top of this big wave, there was the boat with Assipattle in it, riding on the crest of it just like a surfer. And he was cast up high and dry, right next to the king. Well, the Stoorworm's days was numbered. The black smoke filled the sky, and it turned the day to night. The Stoorworm shot out his massive forked tongue into the sky so high that he caught hold of the moon. But luckily it wasn't a full moon. It was only a new moon, a crescent moon. And so the forks of the Stoorworm's tongue slipped over the horns of the moon, and it came back to earth with a crash. And it left a huge hole in the surface of the earth that cut off the land of the Danes from the land of Norway. And then that hole filled up with water, and it remains there to this day, only now we call it the Baltic Sea. And if you look at a map and you see the Baltic Sea, you can see that it has two forks at the end of it, and that's the forks of the Stoorworm's tongue. Now, in its dying agony, the monster raised its head up out of the water, high up into the air, and then down with a crash. And some of its teeth was knocked out and fell into the sea with a splash. And they stayed there to this day and became the Orkney Islands, which is where I live, and that's where I am recording this story for you. Now the head rose up a second time, and bang, down it went, and more teeth got knocked into the sea. And that made the Shetland Islands. A third time the head rose and fell, and more teeth was knocked out into the sea, and that became the Faroe Islands. And then the monster curled up into a tight lump and died. And there it remains to this day, only now we call it Iceland. And the reason why they have volcanoes there, fire chomping from the tops of the mountains, and they have boiling water gushing out of the ground there, the reason for that is because the Stoorworm's liver is still burning. Now the king was delighted. He took Assipattle in his arms and he called him his son. He strapped his magic sword Sickersnapper to him and said, "My boy, my sword is yours, as is my kingdom, and my daughter, if she'll have you." Well, when the princess who had come along as well, when she saw Assipattle, and I suppose after that long horse ride, the ashes had been blown from him, and he was actually a very good-looking young man, and she fell in love with him right away. And so the two of them were married. And as they say, if they're not dead, then they're living yet. Good night, Erin. The Dancers Under the Hill. Now, just outside Stromness, there's a farm called How. It comes from the Old Norse word haug, meaning a mound. And, as you would expect, there was a big mound right next to the farm. And that was said to be a fairy mound. It's where the fairies and the trolls lived. And there was a wee story about two men from Orkney that went into Stromness one Hogmanay to buy whisky for their celebrations. A pig of whisky was bought, a big earthenware chug, and they were walking home up the brae up by Kirsten, and up over the top of the hill and down the other side, and they were passing How, when they heard a strange sound. Music. Music was playing. It was like the sound of a piper. And they heard this wonderful tune playing, and they thought, where's that coming from? So, thinking there might be a party, they set off towards the source of the music. Well, when they got to the big mound that stood beside the farm at How, they saw that there was a door standing wide open in the side of the mound where there had never been a door before, and light was streaming out of it, and music was flowing from that doorway as well. And the man with the pig of whisky, he went inside, and he started to dance to the music of the pipes. He was dancing away to the reel. And the man, other of his friend, was waiting outside for him, and he never came out again. And every time he was sort of passing by with his dancing, he would shout to him, "Are you not coming out yet? Wait till the reel's over," he says. Well, he waited and waited. "You're not coming out yet. Wait till the reel's over." "Are you not coming out yet? Wait till the reel's over." Always the same reply. Well, the man outside got fed up with this, so he decided to go home, and he would wait for his pal whenever he turned up. But his friend never turned up. He waited and waited and waited, but not a thing, no sign of him at all. Well, news started to spread. This guy gone missing. They went and searched for him. His friend told them the story of how they heard the music coming from the mound, and he'd gone in and he was dancing among the fairies, but he never came back out. Well, they searched the mound, but there was no doorway in the side of it. So, the man was gone. Now, a year passed, and the same orphan had gone down to Stromness to buy whisky for the New Year celebrations, just as he'd done the previous year. And he was walking up the road by How when he heard a familiar sound, the sound of pipes playing. he went over cautiously to the side of the mound, and there was the doorway standing wide open, and there was his friend still dancing inside. "Are you not coming out yet?" he said. "Wait till the reel's over," the man replied. Well, he waited until his friend danced past the side of the door, and then he put his hand in and he grabbed him by the collar and he dragged him out of the mound. "Hey, what do you do that for?" said his friend. "I told you I would come out as soon as the reel was finished." "Man," he says, "how long do you think you've been in there?" "Not long," he said, "just joined the dance." "Man, you've been in there for a year and a day." "No, I haven't," he said. "You've been in there for a whole year." "That's rubbish," he says. "No chance." "Then look at your feet, man." Well, when he looked down on his shoes, he discovered to his amazement he'd danced the soles off his shoes. There was only the uppers flapping around on his feet there as well. Well, worse than that, though, was the pig of whiskey on his back was empty. You can't trust those fairies, especially with a dram. Now that mound isn't there anymore, and there is a reason for that. You see, in 1977, it was started to be excavated, and they dug there for 4 years until 1982. And what they found was there was 2 early Neolithic houses, and then there was a maze-how type tomb built on top of it, a big tomb like maze-how. And then that was demolished in the Iron Age, and a roundhouse was built over it, although they used part of the central chamber of the tomb as an earth house under the floor of the roundhouse. And that started to become a bit ruinous, so they built a broch all the way around it, a big stone tower, and it had a village in front of it with ditches and ramparts. Well, that started to fall to ruins as well, and there was Pictish buildings built on the rubble. And when that became ruinous too, and it got covered over, right on the very top there was a Viking woman's grave. So, how do I know that? Well, I know it because, archaeology and stuff. But I have a personal reason for knowing that, because 40 years ago, I find it really hard to say that, but 40 years ago this August, I went to dig at Howe as a 17-year-old. And there was stories circulating around about the place that it was a fairy mound. And when they first started to dig, there was a hurricane blew up, and it blew down the fines hut at the site, and all the fines bags were scattered stick on all the barbed wire fences in a sort of half a mile or a mile radius of the site. And local people would nod and say, fairy mound, messing with the fairies, shouldn't do that. So, I started my archaeological career digging a fairy mound. This is a Viking story that was written as a poem by a man called Bragi the Skald. Bragi, it should be known if you don't know it already, was the Nordic god of poetry. And Bragi the Skald wrote this poem probably in Orkney around 850 AD. So it's a proper, true Viking story. It's called The Everlasting Battle. Now there was a king in the Northlands called King Hogni, and Hogni was a very powerful ruler. And he had a daughter called Hild, who was the most beautiful of all the women. She was absolutely gorgeous, and everybody wanted to marry her. But King Hogni held her as his dearest treasure, and he wouldn't let just anyone marry his daughter. It had to be someone that he felt was worthy of her. Now, one day, King Hogni sailed away to a big meeting of all the kings of the Northlands. And while he was away, there was a young king called Hedin. He sailed into the town where King Hogni's castle was, and he carried away Hild, the beautiful daughter. Now, some people said that there was already a relationship between King Hedin and Hild. But who knows? But it seems that the two of them were in cahoots over this, and they sailed away. Well, news was brought to King Hogni, where he was at his meetings of the Northland kings, to say that his daughter had been abducted by King Hedin, and his fury knew no bounds. It was as hot as a volcano. He was absolutely beside himself with rage, and he immediately gathered together his warriors. He took to his longships and he sailed back home. But when he got there, he discovered that King Hedin had already left. "Where did he go?" asked King Hogni. "He sailed west, your majesty, west across the sea towards Orkney." So the king prepared his longships, and he too sailed west across the sea to Orkney. And when he arrived in Orkney, he said, "Had anyone seen King Hedin and his fleet of longships?" Yes, people said yes, he sailed to the island of Hoy. So he sailed to Hoy, and he found the place where the longships were drawn up on the beach, and he too drew up his longships, and he headed inland, and he struck camp there. He erected a fine tent for himself, and his warriors prepared to do battle the next day. There was much sharpening of swords and axes that night, I can tell you. Now, during the night, Hild came to her father and said, "Father, King Hedin wishes to be reconciled with you. He carried me away for love, but he would have you as a friend rather than an enemy, and so he is offering you a large sum of gold if you will be his friend, accept him as his son-in-law, and let him marry me. I will never take a thing from him," he said. "And does he think that I'm so short of cash that I need to accept a bribe from the likes of him, an upstart like him? Go back to him and tell him to prepare for the fight the next day. There will be a battle at dawn." So Hild went back to King Hedin with the news. Well, the following morning at dawn, the two armies drew up in a large plain facing each other. And again Hild came to her father and said, "I have a message from King Hedin. He would like to give you this beautiful gold arm ring, which is intricately wrought, a thing of great beauty that has been passed down in his family for a long time. And he would like to have you as his friend, not his enemy." "Too late," said King Hogni. "Too late. I've already drawn my sword Dennisleaf, and if that sword is drawn, a man has to die before it can be put back into its scabbard. Go back to him and tell him to prepare to fight." So they did. The two armies clashed in a terrible battle. It became known afterwards as the Strife of the Hjadnings. And the battle raged all night, and many men were killed on both sides. Many fell. Now, as the day was drawing to a close, there was no winner. Both sides had lost a lot of men, but there was no side that was clearly getting the better of the other one. So they retired back to their camps, and they had something to eat and drink, and the wounded bound up their wounds, and the dead were left on the battlefield. It was littered with corpses and broken weapons and shattered shields. Now that night, Hild went down onto the field of battle, and walked among the slain, and as she did so, she sang a song. And oh, what a song it was! It was a song of enchantment. Because Hild, you see, her name means battle. And she was one of the Valkyries, one of the handmaidens of Odin, who chose the slain on the battlefield. They choose who will go to Valhalla and fight at the Battle of Ragnarok at the end of time. And Hild sang her song of enchantment, and as she did so, all the dead bodies turned to stone, and all the broken swords and spears and axes and the shattered shields, they all turned to stone too. And the next morning, when the sun rose, all the dead men became alive again, no longer stone but flesh and blood, and healed of the sometimes horrific injuries. And they all sprang up on their feet again, ready to do battle. All the broken swords and axes and spears and shields were also made new, and ready to fight for another day. As soon as the two kings arrived on the battlefield, they couldn't believe their eyes. There were their slain comrades standing waiting for them. But they joined in battle again for the second day, and they fought all day long until, in the evening, there was many killed on both sides, but again no winner. So they went back to their camp to bind their wounds and to drink and to eat. And Hild walked among the field of the slain, and she sang her song of enchantment. And again they were all turned to stone. And the next morning when the sun rose, up they sprang ready to do battle. And after that continued. Every day that the kings came back to the battlefield, there were the men, ready and waiting to fight. And the fight went on and on and on. Day followed day, week followed week, months followed months, years followed years. But they were brought back to life by magic. And the two kings were trapped in that cycle of time. They didn't age either. They carried on living just as they always had. And they say that these days, that battle is now invisible to mortal eyes, but somewhere on the island of Hoy, there is a plain where two armies meet every day and fight each other, and they will carry on to do that forevermore until the trumpet sounds for Ragnarok, the battle at the end of time. Now, this story that I'm going to tell you is based on a real person. So I have no idea whether the story is true or not. It's how the story has been passed down over the centuries. But it did happen to a real woman in the 1630s on the island of Westray. Now, that's the island where my mother came from. So it's a story that's well known among folk on the island. Now, there was a young man called Benjamin Garrick, and he was getting his boat ready one fine summer's day to go to the fishing. Him and the neighbouring men were all gathering together the gear, and they were getting the boat ready to push down into the sea, go to the fishing, when he saw that there was a figure walking along the beach towards them. And he recognised the figure. It was his girlfriend, Janet Forsyth. Well, at least he thought she was his girlfriend. To be honest, he wasn't really sure, because sometimes she was really, really keen on him, and then other times she would hardly give him the time of day. She just blew hot and cold the whole time. So he didn't really know, but he hoped that she was, because, he liked her. Well, this day, Jeanette was very, very strange. So she acted in a way that Benjamin had never seen before. She went up to him and she said, "Benji, don't go to the fishing today." "Why not?" Just don't go." But why?" "Look, I can't tell you," she said, but just don't go to the fishing today. Please stay at home." "But why? I mean, why should I stay at home? I can't let the guys down. We have to work together." "Look," she said, "I had a dream last night. And I dreamt that if you went to the fishing today, then something terrible would happen, and you would never return. So please, Benji, please, don't go to the fishing." Well, he laughed, a kind of a hollow laugh, and he said, But why? I mean, look at that sky. There's not a cloud in it. Sun shining. It's a fine day. Couldn't be better. What could possibly go wrong on such a day as this?" And then, to his amazement, she just burst into tears, and she hung on his neck, and she wept into his shoulder, and she said, "Don't leave me, Benji, don't leave me." And then she turned around, and she ran away, sobbing, along the shore. And his friends just looked at him, and Benji just shrugged his shoulders. And then they pushed the boat down the beach and into the sea, and they hoisted the sail, and away they went. And they were never seen again on the island of Westray. But what could go wrong on such a day as that? Fog. You see, Orkney lies between two bodies of water. The Atlantic Ocean is on the west, but on the east there is the North Sea. And the North Sea waters are cold and frigid. And so, on a hot summer's day, the warm air from the land mixes with the cold air from the sea, and it turns to fog. And that fog can roll in as fast as a freight train. And that's what happened that day. The boat was at sea, it was swallowed up by fog, and they never came back. Now, if that wasn't bad enough for poor Janet, things just got worse, because her mother had died a long time before, but she lived with her father, who was a fisherman. But he took ill suddenly and died, and she was left all alone in a small tumble-down cottage with nothing but a boat down in the boat-nest. Now, Janet knew a thing or two about herbal remedies. She knew plants that could cure ailments, and she could make up potions, and she could make up ointments, and people went to her for help when they were ailing. But people started to notice the change in her. I mean, she wasn't going out much. She wasn't mixing with people. She wasn't friendly anymore. She didn't want people's company. And so people started to stay away from her, too. And the local bairns started to spy on her. And at night they would climb up on the roof of her wee house, and they would look down the smoke hole, and they could see her sitting by the side of the fire. And she cut a tragic figure. She sat by the side of the fire with her arms wrapped around herself and rocking backwards and forwards, and always singing a sad song to herself. The song that she sang was a lament for lost love. Well, people shunned her and kept away from her, but there was something else that she did which made people feel very uneasy. because when the winds rose and the seas started to thunder and roar, she would slip away from her cottage and she would run down to the boathouse by the shore, and she would push that small boat of her father's down into the sea, and she would hoist the sail and away she would go, in weather that nobody would dare to take a boat out in. But she always came back, soaking wet but safe and sound. That boat weathered all the storms, and she managed to pull it with sheer determination up to the boathouse where it would be sheltered, and then she would go home, and she would sit by the fire, and she would hug herself, and she would sing her sad songs. Well, there was a new word that started to appear on people's lips when they spoke about Jeanette Forsyth, and the word was witch. Well, of course she's a witch. I mean, did she not say that on young Benji Garrick that she was sweet on? She said that he would be lost at sea, and sure enough he did. Well, what happened there, I wonder? And the fact that she goes out in all that storms in a boat and survives? Aye, I think she raises the storms herself. Aye, I think so too. Yeah, I bet that she actually goes out to the sea and communes with the devil himself out in the middle of that storm. That's what she does. Sure enough. Aye, now watch out for her. Witch. She's a witch. Keep away for her. Witch. Janet used to hear these rumours being spread as well, but she paid no attention. She didn't care. They could call her what she liked. Well, things went on like that for a while. But one day, events stepped in and it all came to a head. You see, there was a bark. A sailing ship was caught in a storm, a terrible raging storm, and it was driven towards the rocks of Westray, and the folk gathered down on the shore to watch it. Now, there wasn't a lot that they thought that they could do anyway, but someone's misfortune was another one's good luck. If a ship went on the rocks in Westray, well, there was plenty of driftwood coming ashore in an island with no wood. That was valuable. And all the sails and the ropes and all that too, and whatever cargo she was carrying would come ashore. And people were standing down there and they were waiting eagerly for the ship to strike the rocks and break up. They were waiting to see what precious cargoes was inside. They were waiting for that timber to be washed ashore. And Janet Forsyth went down next to them and she looked at them with contempt and she goes, "Aren't you going to try to help?" There was no reply. People cast a black look on her and then carried on staring hungrily at the ship. Janet just shook her head and away she went. She went to her father's boathouse. She grabbed it and she dragged it down to the shore. She pushed it into the waves, and it was a struggle to get it launched because the waves that were breaking on the shore were so strong it just pushed the boat back around again. But eventually, sheer determination, she managed to get that small boat into the sea. And she pulled up a sail and she tacked away and she sailed into that teeth of that gale towards that ship that was in distress. Well, the people watched her with disbelief, and they could see this tiny, frail boat of hers climbing up a huge wave, and then down the other side into the abyss. But then after a while they would see that tiny little boat climbing up another wave, over the top and then down the trough on the other side, down into the watery abyss, and people would say, "Well, she's gone now. There's no way the boat can weather a wave like that." But there it was again, climbing another wave, down the other side. And that boat climbed wave after wave after wave until it got alongside the ship. Janet tied the boat to the side of the ship, and she climbed up on the deck, and she started to shout orders to the crew. the captain of the ship was so amazed. Where the hell did she come from? But he was desperate, and she had an air of authority about her, like someone that knew what they were talking about, and she did. Her father was a fisherman. She had been taken out on that boat since she was just a bairn, and she knew every tide around the island and where every rock was, every skerry, every danger. And so she managed to get the boat to tack that ship, to tack away from the rocks, and she got it into a piece of better water where the tide took it around the headland, and eventually the boat was able to get into the safety of Pierwell Bay. And once it was in the shelter of Pierwell, it dropped the anchor and the boat was saved. That ship was safe. The captain said, "My dear girl, I have no idea who you are, where you came from, but you've saved our lives. Everyone on this ship owes you their lives. No, I don't have much, but I have here a bag of money. I would like you to take it. Please take this as a small token of our eternal gratitude to you for what you did." But Janet just shook her head. No, thank you, she said. No, you see, I had a love once, and he was lost at sea. And I would hope that if he was in danger, if his life was in peril, that someone would come to his aid too and help him, just the way that I helped you. So no, thank you, I don't want your money. And she climbed down the side of the ship and into her own little boat, and she untied it and she headed back towards her own boat mast, dragged the boat up, went back home and sat by the fire, and she sang her sad songs. Now, these days, if somebody did that, you get a medal or something. You'd get some sort of a scroll to put on your wall, but not in the 1630s you didn't. All it did was confirm people's beliefs that she was a witch. She must be in league with the devil to have saved that ship. Also, she'd cheated them of the ship as well, and all the goods that were in it. So she was denounced to the church, and she was arrested, and she was taken to Kirkwall, to the great cathedral of St. Magnus, where she was held in a cell to await her trial. Now, on the day of her trial, she was brought in front of all the great and the good of Kirkwall, who would pass judgment on her. And all the people turned up to hear the evidence as well. And the evidence came from folk in Westray. There was the usual stories of animals going sick or cows stopping milking, and it was all her fault, of course. There was even a man that said that he went to sea one day and he became sick. He felt sick. And so they headed back to the shore, and he saw Janet Forsyth down at the shore, and he accused her of using her witchcraft to make him feel sick when he was at sea. And she had a bucket in her hand, and she scooped up a bucket of salt water from the sea, and she threw it over him. And he felt better after that. Now, it's enough to make you laugh, isn't it? But it was no laughing matter in the 1630s. No, that was enough to have you convicted. And the judge declared that she was guilty as charged of the crime of witchcraft. "Do you have anything to say before I pass judgment on you?" he said. "No," said Jeanette. "I have nothing to say to you, because I don't care. I no longer care. You can do whatever you want to me. I don't. You see, I've done no harm. I've done no wrong. And, when I put to sea in my boat, well, I always hoped, beyond hope, that someday I might find the love that I had lost at sea. But I never did. And if any power protected me when I was in the storms at the sea, it was God, not the devil. But now you can do what you want with me. I've had enough of life. I have no fear of death. So do your worst. The judge, he was not happy with a statement like that. He said, well, there is only one punishment suitable for such a crime. You'll be bound by your hand and feet, and you'll be taken to the head of the loan, where you'll be worried at the stake, and then your body burnt to ashes, and God have mercy on your soul. To be worried at the stake meant that you were tied to a stake, and then a rope was put around your neck by the hangman, who twisted it and turned it until you were strangled to death, and then your body burnt to ashes. The crowd there were not sympathetic. "Hey, burn the witch," they cried. And there was a crowd of sailors had just come in at the door as well, Royal Naval men that had sheltered from a storm. And they were shouting, burn the witch, along with all the other people. And she looked towards them, and then suddenly her face went as white as a sheet, and she said, Benji, save me, Benji. One of the sailors ran towards her, and she fainted. He picked her up off the ground. He hugged her. He kissed her. He called her his love. The judge was furious. Unhand the prisoner at once, he said. God, if it wasn't for the fact that you were serving in His Majesty's Navy and fighting against our enemies, I would have you tried for contempt of court. And poor Janet was dragged along the floor of the cathedral, crying out, Benji, save me, Benji. Now that night in Kirkwall there was great celebrations. You see, the Royal Navy ships were sheltering from that same storm that almost wrecked the ship in Westray, and they had put into Kirkwall Bay and anchored there. Now the local lairds, all the big landowners, they'd invited the officers of the ships to come and dine with them. And there was lots of claret, and port was drunk, and also, I dare say, quite a bit of smuggled French brandy and smuggled Dutch gin was consumed too, so that they started to get rather merry and also feeling a bit generous. So they had ordered that barrels of beer should be opened in front of the cathedral and dished out to the local people and to the sailors who were ashore. Well, free booze? No Arcadian's going to turn that down, and no Royal Naval sailor either. They were all drinking it just like a cool drinking a bucket of water on a hot day. Well, the next morning they had the witch burning to look forward to as well. It would be a great excitement. The next day there would have been a few sore heads in Kirkwall, and a few mouths that felt like they were full of ashes, but they went up at the appointed time to the cathedral to watch the witch being taken out, and led to the top of the lawn where she would be strangled at the stake, worried and burnt to ashes. But somebody came running out of the cathedral in a panic, shouting, the witch is gone! She's gone, she's not there, she's gone. People ran in, and sure enough, there was the cell door standing wide open, and the jailer who was meant to be guarding it was slumped in a chair, sound asleep. Well, they searched high and low. Kirkwall was scoured, and all the surrounding area was searched, but there was not a trace of the Westray storm witch, Janet Forsyth. Not a thing. Now, years passed, And there was one of those lairds, those big landowners who lived in Kirkwall. He was a bakey of Tankernes. They lived at Tankernes House, which is now the museum. And his business as a merchant took him down to the city of Manchester. He was walking along the street in Manchester when he saw a shop sign saying Benjamin Garrick, and he thought, well, there's a name that you find in Orkney too. I wonder if this is an Orkney person. I'll go in and have a look. So he went in, and to his amazement, who was standing behind the counter but Janet Forsyth, the Westray storm witch. You're Janet Forsyth, aren't you? He said. Well, the poor girl, her face went white as a sheet. Benji, she shouted. Benjamin. A man came through from the back of the shop. Well, he'd recognized her all right, but she'd changed. She'd put on weight for a start, and also she looked about 20 years younger than the pathetic, careworn, sad woman that he saw in the cathedral standing trial. So he asked what had happened, and Benjamin took up the story. He said that summer's day in Westray he'd gone to sea all right in the boat, and the fog had rolled in and swallowed them up, and they couldn't see where to go at all. They had no idea where they were, and that's a dangerous thing to be, because they could end up on a skerry, broken on the rocks and lost at sea and drowned. People never learnt to swim in those days, so they wouldn't have lasted long. Or they could have drifted out into the Atlantic Ocean and away and lost. And when the fog lifted, there might be no sign of land at all, and so they would have been lost as well. And so they very, very cautiously went this way and that. They took the sail on, they rowed gently, this way, that, until they saw a dark shape in the distance, and they headed towards it, and they could see it was a ship. So they went alongside, but it was only when they got alongside the ship that they realized what it was. And to their horror, it was a man-of-war, a Royal Navy warship. They were taken on board, and they were press-ganged into the Navy and made to serve on board the ship. And they fought in battles, and they sailed here, there, and everywhere. And they were caught in the same storm that the boat, the ship that Jeanette had saved, had been caught in. And they had put into Kirkwall. Well, the next day Benji had gone ashore with some of his friends, and they could see people walking into the cathedral, and they thought, wonder what's going on there. So they went in to have a look. Curious, you know. And sure enough, there was a witch trial, and the verdict had just been passed, and everybody was shouting, burn the witch, and they joined in too. And then, to his horror, when the witch turned around, he saw that it was his sweetheart, his own beloved Janet Forsyth. And, of course, she was pulled away to the dungeon, to the cells, and locked up. Well, he decided that he had to do something to try to save her. Now, the captain of the ship that she'd saved was in Kirkwall as well. It was also lying anchored safely in Kirkwall Bay at that time. You see, the captain of the ship had wanted to give evidence on behalf of Jeanette, but he was not allowed to, because they said that he must be bewitched by her. And so his testimony was not legal. It was not worth listening to. So he was dismissed. But he wanted to help, and so Benjamin asked if they could come up with a plan between them, and they did. Now that night, they knew that the jailer, he liked a dram or two as well. So they waited until that beer was being dished out, and they took beer into the cathedral and gave it to the jailer, and he drank, and he drank, and he drank. Now maybe they put something in the ale to make him sleep. Maybe he just drank so much he didn't need anything to make him sleep. But sleep he did. Well, when he was asleep, all they had to do was just take the keys and unlock the door and take her out. The captain of the ship took her away up over the brae towards Inverness Bay. And there the ship was lying safely anchored waiting for her. Benji hugged her and said that he would see her soon, but he had to go back to his ship because if he disappeared, people would get suspicious. So he left her in the safe keeping of the captain of the ship, who sailed away to his home port of Liverpool. And he took her home to meet his wife and his family, and he told her the whole story of what had happened and how he would not be standing there now alive and well in front of them if it wasn't for this poor, wretched girl. And she was taken in and looked after, given dresses and food and taken care of as a member of the family because she had saved the life of the woman's husband. Well, the Royal Navy ship sailed back down to Portsmouth, and as soon as it got there, Benji jumped ship and he headed towards Liverpool. He had the address of the captain, and he went there and he was reunited with his love, and the two of them were married. Now, the captain of the ship and the owners of the ship had gathered together some money, and they gave to them, and it was a good sum as well. But they decided not to stay in Liverpool. They would head to Manchester and set up a new life there. And with the money they bought a little shop, and they were doing very well for themselves now, away from where no one knew them, and no one knew the story of the Westray storm witch. Well, when Bakey heard that, he said, "I've never heard such a story in my life, and I swear to you, I promise, your secret is safe with me. I will not tell a living soul." And obviously he didn't keep his promise, otherwise I wouldn't be able to tell you the story now. But he went home, and he never betrayed the secret to people who might want harm on her, of poor Jeanette Forsyth. And so her and Benji Garrick lived in Manchester, as far as we know, for the rest of their days. And who knows, in the city of Manchester, to this day, there may still be descendants of Jeanette Forsyth, the Westray storm witch. This is a Viking Age story, and it really is a Viking Age story. It was a story that must have been known to the Vikings, because this is a part of it that was written as a poem by a man called Bragi the Skald around 850 AD. So it's thought that it was probably written in Orkney. But it's an old, old story. It's called Why the Sea is Salt. Now, a long time ago, there was a king in Denmark called King Frodi. And during the reign of Frodi, there was a time of peace and plenty. And it was known as the Frodi Peace. Now, there was a reason behind this. It wasn't just an accident. It wasn't because he was a good king. But during Frodi's reign, he found a huge quernstone in Denmark. Now, a quernstone, it's a millstone, the flat, round stone that you turn the one on top of the other to grind out grain, and you drop it through a hole in the top, and the flour comes out the side. But this quernstone that was discovered during the reign of Frodi was no ordinary quernstone, because it was huge. It was massive. And it was so big that no one could turn it. But Frodi had it brought to his castle, and it was put in a special room by itself. Now time passed, and Frodi went to visit his friend, the King of Sweden. And when he was there, he saw that the King of Sweden had two giant bond maidens there. And they were of the race of giants. They were huge women, but they were bond maidens, they were slaves. "Would you consider selling me those slaves?" he asked the King of Sweden. "Well, yes, I could indeed," he said. And so he sold them to her. And Frodi brought back the two giant maidens back to his castle. Now these giant women were called Fenja and Menja. And Fenja and Menja were brought to the room where the giant quernstone stood. And Frodi said, "I want you to turn this quernstone for me night and day." Well, they started to turn it, but this was no ordinary quernstone. It was magic, and it could grind out whatever the owner wished it to. And King Frodi wished for gold. Grind out gold. So Fenja and Menja set to work turning the giant quernstone, and gold flowed out from between the stones. The gold was gathered up, it was taken away and put into other rooms. The treasury was full to the brim with gold, and many other rooms were filled up with gold as well, until there was so much gold it was becoming a problem what to do with it. And Frodi was the richest king that ever lived. Well, after he'd had enough with the gold, he said to Fenja and Menja, "Now I want you to grind me out something else. I want you to grind me out peace and plenty, fertility, good luck for the land." So they turned the quernstone, but nothing came out of it. There was no sign of anything coming out of the quernstone. But there was. Good luck flowed from it. Fertility flowed from it. It was a time of incredible peace. There was no fighting, no wars. Even husbands and wives, brothers and sisters didn't squabble and argue between them. There was no fighting, no arguing, nothing. And what a time for plenty as well. The crops were hanging heavy with grain, and the fruit trees the branches were hanging down under the weight of the fruit on them. All the cows had twin calves, the sheep had twin lambs, and there was so much fish in the sea that you could have walked dried foot from Denmark across to Norway on the back of the fish. It was a wonderful time, and everybody was happy. Everybody, that is, except for two people, Fenja and Menja, because they had to turn that quernstone all day long. And they had no time to rest, no peace, nothing. So they complained to King Frodi, "Will you not let us rest? Can we not take a break?" "No," he said, "no, you can't take a break." "Well, it's hard work," they said, "turning this quernstone day after day, night after night." "Well, I'll let you take a break," he says, "as long as it takes to sing a song, or for as long as the cuckoo can hold his peace," he said. Well, that was not a reply that Fenja and Menja liked at all, not one little bit. So they sang a song. Oh, they sang a song all right. They sang a song called Grotesanger, the Lay of Grote. And this song was about hate and war and strife, pestilence, disease, misery, treachery. And invisible to sight, that is what flowed out of the quernstone. There was a terrible time. The armies invaded the country. Sons and fathers killed each other. Mothers and daughters killed each other. It was an awful, awful time. On all the crops failed. The fish disappeared. There was nothing to eat. It was a desperate time. And one day, a sea king called Mysinger sailed into the city where Frodi lived. And they stormed the castle and killed King Frodi. And they carried away a lot of his gold, but they also carried away Fenja and Menja and the quernstone Groti. And Mysingur had the quern set up in his ship. And he said to Fenja and Menja, right, I know what this quernstone does. I know its secret, and I want you to grind me something now. What would you like us to grind? Said Fenja and Menja. Salt, he said. I could use some salt. You see, salt was a really expensive commodity in those days, and it wasn't easy to get hold of, so it made sense that he wanted to have salt so that he didn't have to sail around and trade for it. So they started to grind out the salt. And after a while they said, have you got enough salt yet? And he said, no. No, carry on grinding out salt. So they did. They ground out so much salt that the ship became swamped with it. It was flooded with salt. And soon it sank to the bottom of the sea. And where it sank was just to the east of the island of Stroma, which lies in the Pentland Firth between Orkney and Caithness. And Fenja and Menja, being of the race of giants, were immortals. And so they carried on, grinding away at the bottom of the sea. And water flowed down the hole in the top of the quernstone. And where the quern lies, there is now a whirlpool called the Selkie, Svelgar in Old Norse, which means the swallower, because it swallowed ships whole. And they are still there to this day, still turning the quernstone and still grinding out salt. And if you don't believe me, go down to the sea, dip your finger in it, and have a taste. Yeah, that is why the sea is salty. Orkney is very fortunate to have its own Icelandic saga, the Orkneyinga saga, the saga of the Orkney Islanders, originally known as Jarlasaga, the saga of the Jarls of Orkney, the Earls of Orkney. And it tells of the Jarls over a period of 300 or so years. Now, there's many, many stories from the saga. I can't sit here and tell you the whole saga because it would take more than the day that's left in front of me now. But what I will do during this strange days of ours is I will tell you some stories from the saga. And this saga, this story, begins right at the very beginning. Now, you see, when Norway was unified by King Harald Fairhair, Harfargi, he had defeated all the regional kings in Norway and he had brought them all under his control. But Norway was still being ravaged by Vikings sailing across from the islands to the west, from Orkney and Shetland. And so he gathered a huge fleet together and he sailed to the islands and he defeated all the Vikings there and he subjected the islands to his own rule. Now, he had a right-hand man with him, a Rogvald of Mora, and Rogvald was an important jarl in the north of Norway, and he lost a son, Ivar, during the battle. And so the king gave him as compensation the islands of Orkney and Shetland. But the ungrateful wretch didn't want them. He had a fine earldom himself, and he wasn't going to start out on some small group of islands that was known for their Vikings, so he gave it to his brother, Sigurd who became known as Sigurd the Powerful. And Sigurd teamed up with a man called Thorstein the Red, who was the son of Od the Deep-Minded, who was the most amazing woman in the Icelandic sagas. You can read about her in Laxdælar saga, but that's another story. Now, Thorstein was killed, and that left Sigurd on his own. And he was fighting with all the Pictish jarls in the north of Scotland. And there was one called Megbrigte Ton, and the word ton meant tooth or tusk. And he was called that because he had a large protruding tusk sticking out of his mouth. Now, the two earls met and agreed that they would talk peace terms. And they agreed to meet at a certain place on a certain day at a certain time. And each man would take 20 warriors with him on horseback. So that was agreed. But back in Sigurd's camp, Sigurd's men, some of the chieftains that supported him, were saying, you know, Sigurd, these Picts, can you trust them? I mean, really? I'm not so sure. I mean, 20 men? What happens if they turn up with more than 20 men? What are you going to do? How are you going to defend yourself if they break the oath and turn up with more than 20 men? Now, if I was you, I would take a few extra men along with me, just to be on the safe side. Well, Sigurd was swayed by this argument, and so he decided that he would take 20 men on horses, as he had agreed, but he would take another 20 men riding behind the horseman, sitting on the back of the horse, so 2 men on every horse. Well, they went to the meeting place, and Megbrigte Ton arrived there, agreed at the time that they agreed, and he had taken with him 20 men on horseback, as they had agreed, as oaths were sworn to agree. Well, Megbrigte could see that there were 2 pairs of legs down the sides of each horse, and he knew that he'd been betrayed and tricked, so he told his men to prepare for battle. Now the Vikings dropped their extra 20 men on the ground, and they went around behind Megbrigte Ton, so they had him in a pincer movement. And the Picts were attacked, and all of them were killed, to a man. Now, Sigurd did something rather unusual then, because this was not something that was customary among the Vikings. He said that they should cut the heads off all the slain Picts and tie them to their saddles as a trophy and set off home with them. Well, they did that. The heads were hacked off and they were tied by the hair to their saddles, and they rode off. Now, Sigurd, of course, being the Jarl, had cut the head off of Earl Megbrigte Ton and tied it to his saddle, and he rode away. And as he rode, the head was bump, 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 bump against his thigh. And that tooth that stuck out of Megbrigte's mouth scratched Sigurd's thigh. And that scratch turned poisonous. Blood poisoning set in, and that brought about the death of Sigurd the Powerful, the first Jarl of Orkney. He was killed by the dead man's tooth. So Megbrigte got his revenge on him from beyond the grave. This is one of my favourite stories. It's called Selkie Wife. There's various versions, but I like this one. Now, there was a young man was walking home late one night in the parish of Dearness. Now, Dearness is in the east mainland of Orkney. In fact, it's almost an island. It's only held on to the rest of Orkney by a thin strip of sand. So, he's walking home. What he's been doing out of that hour, I don't know. None of my business. But he's walking home when he hears something. A sound. An unusual sound, and not a sound that he was expecting to hear at all. Because he hears the sound of fiddles playing. Music. At this time of night. So, he's curious. He wants to know who's playing. What's going on? So he follows the sound. But he's wary, because it could be anyone. It could be some very unpleasant people. He doesn't want to walk into a camp where he's not welcome. So he's very careful about approaching slowly. And he comes to a piece of rock that's jutting out from the shore onto the beach. And he peeps around it. And there is the source of the music. There are two fiddlers sitting on a flat rock, playing fiddles. And in front of them on the beach, on the sandy beach, there is lots and lots of people dancing. White bodies, dancing in the moonlight. And around them is lying dark shapes like animals lying asleep. He watches this for a while. And then curiosity again gets the better of him, and he gets down on his belly among the rocks and the seaweed, because the piece of shore that he's on is rocky, but there's a sandy strip further on. And he very carefully crawls over the rocks and the seaweed until he gets to where these dark shapes, these animals, are lying asleep. But when he gets there, he sees that they're not animals lying asleep at all. They're skins, seal skins, empty seal skins. And then he knows that this must be the Selkie folk. Seals that have the power to take off their skin at certain times of the tide and take human form. And they can dance in the moonlight. They love music. They love to dance. But they can only do it certain nights of the year. And as soon as the sun rises, they have to go back to the sea. Now, one of the skins is more beautiful than the others. It's a soft, silky, silvery-coloured skin. So he rolls it up, puts it under his jacket, and he crawls back to his hiding place, and he watches them all night as they dance. Now, as soon as the first light of the sun peeps above the horizon, the music stops, and all the dancers rush down to their skins and pull them on, and they become seals again, and they swim off into the sea. All that is, except for one young maiden, who frantically searches for her skin. She can't find it on the sand. She can't find it on the rocks and the seaweed. And she runs right around the corner of the rocks, right into the young man's arms. And he holds her tight, and he looks down into her big, beautiful, brown, frightened eyes, and he thinks that she is the most beautiful woman that he has ever seen in his whole life. And he knows that he will not be happy until he gets her as his wife. Now, she has other ideas, mind you. She punches him and kicks him and bites him and scratches him and squeaks out to her in the Selkie tongue, because Selkies have their own language as well, you know. But he was bigger than her, and so he carries her home to his house, where he lives with his mother. Now, what he said to his mother when he came in with a naked girl under one arm and a sealskin under the other, I don't know. But, you know, the old woman, she was no fool. She knew exactly who, or should I say, what, this girl was. And the poor Selkie woman, she just sat by the fire and she wept. She sobbed and she sobbed and she sobbed until you'd think that there was no more tears to shed, but she still found some. And the old woman felt sorry for her. And she tried to comfort her, to be kind to her. And she found an old dress that used to be hers when she was young and slim. And she gave it to the Selkie woman to put on. But the Selkie woman just sat and sobbed, and this went on for many days, more than a week, possibly 3, who knows. But eventually the sobbing stops. And the old woman is kind to her, and so is the man. And it's obvious that the Selkie woman is very attached to the man because she follows him around everywhere. And she's curious as well, and the old woman can see this, and so she teaches her how to bake and brew, and cook food, and how to spin wool and knit and weave, and all of these things that a wife was expected to do back in those long ago times. Now, she always followed him around. It was obvious that the two of them were very fond of each other, and so it came as no surprise, of course, when they were married. And then the bairns came. So they had 4 fine, peerie bairns, and they said that there was never bonnier bairns in Dearness than those ones. And the unusual thing as well, when you think about it, back in those days, nobody learnt to swim. But those bairns, the sea was their second home. Well, time went by. And one day, the Selkie wife took her husband to one side and she said, "I want to speak to you." "Yeah?" "I want you to make me a promise. If I can, if it's in my ability to do it, then of course I will, dear. Well, you know that I'm a creature of the sea," she says. "And I know that you have my skin. And I know where you keep it. It's in the big kist in the ben end of the hoose." Now, you see, in those days, the old hooses were called button bens, and the butt end was where he did all cooking in the living area, and the ben end was a bedroom and a best room as well. I was born in one, actually. But anyway, there was the ben end was the good end, and the kist is a chest. So she says, "I know that you have my skin, and I know where you keep it. It's in the kist in the ben end of the house. And I know you always keep it locked, and you always keep that key on you, but I want you to make me a promise. If you love me, if you really love me, then never let me get that key. Because I can't promise that I won't go back to the sea. The temptation might be too much for me. Never put me in that position. Never let me get that key. I love it here. I love you, and I love my bairns, and I don't want to go back. But if you love me, never let me get that key." "I promise," he says. "I swear." Now, time passed, and it was the Lammas Fair. And the Lammas Fair was a great event in Kirkwall, held around the cathedral. And people came from all over Orkney and from Shetland and from Scotland, all over. and everything imaginable was sold there, and there was rides and games for the children, and there was lovely things to eat, and there was everything from a horse to a hen's leg was available to buy there. So the man decided it would be a great treat for the bairns to take them to the fair that day. Now his wife decided that she was going to stay at home and give the hoose a good tidy up while they were away. So the man got the bairns all dressed up in their best clothes, and he had them all washed and hairbrushed, and he went and had a shave and a wash, and then he put on his Sunday best suit. And he got the horse and cart ready, and they headed off along the road into Kirkwall. Now, they had a lovely day there. The bairns had the time of their lives. They were playing on swing boats, and they were eating sponge sugar on a stick, things that they'd never even heard of, yet alone tasted. And they were having the most wonderful time. And when it got late, the man decided that it was time to get them home, so he put them in the back of the horse and cart, and he set off back for Derness. Now, the bairns were tired, and they were nodding off by the time that he was getting to home. But when he got near to the house, he could see that there was something wrong here. There was no lights on at the window, and there was no smoke coming out the chimney. And when they got nearer, he saw that the front door was standing wide open, and a fear gripped him. And he ran inside, and he shouted for his wife, but there was no answer, and then a terrible thought gripped him. And he ran through to the ben end of the house, and there was the kist, with the key in the lock, and the lid wide open, and the sealskin was gone. And then he realized what must have happened. You see, in his hurry to get ready and go, he took off his old jacket and he put on his new suit, but he forgot to take the key out of his old work jacket pocket. And when the Selkie wife was tidying up the house, she wouldn't have been looking for a key, but as soon as she picked up that jacket, she could feel something hard in the pocket, and she knew what that was. She put her hand in the pocket and took it out, and there was the key. And she knew what that key opened and what was inside waiting for her. She put the key in the lock and turned it with a click and opened the lid, and there was her skin. And when she saw the skin, just the urge, just to one more time, just to touch it was too strong. And then when she touched it, the urge just to pick it up was too great. And then the urge just to hold it close to her was too strong to fight. And when she felt that skin next to her own, and she could still smell the salt on it, she knew she had to go back. She had no choice. She took it and ran out the house and down to the shore, and with a cry of anger and anguish she pulled on the skin and became a seal again and swam off into the sea. Well, her husband never stopped searching for his Selkie wife. He walked up and down that beach, but he never saw her again. But they did say that when the bairns went down to the shore to play, a seal would swim backwards and forwards in front of them, sobbing like its heart was breaking. In Orkney, there's a race of creatures called the Finn folk, and the Finn folk live in a city under the sea called Finnfolkaheim. But they also live on beautiful floating islands that float on the surface of the sea in the summer months. And sometimes you see an island floating where there isn't an island. And they called it Hildeland. It's from an Old Norse word, hildren, which means a mirage at sea. It's an apparition of an island where there wasn't one. And I should know, because I have seen Hildeland. I have seen it in some detail, in fact. Many years ago now, actually, nearly 40 years ago, I was visiting my family in Tankerness, where I was born, on the East Mainland of Orkney. And me and two of my brothers were walking along the beach, and one of them had just bought a pair of binoculars. So we were underneath what is now the main runway at Kirkwall Airport, on the shore, and we could see that there was an island between Shappensea and Stronsay, where there shouldn't have been an island. And what's more, there was a big building on it, a big grey building with a big round arched door. Now, having the binoculars, we were able to look at it and try to figure out where it was. But we didn't recognise it. I think it might have been the Husa Germount on Sandy. I couldn't swear to that, though. But it was a lot nearer than it should have been. And watching it then, it started to melt away on the west coast. So the left-hand side of the island, as we were facing it, started to melt away and lift out the water. And then the east side followed suit, and it started to shimmer and disappear as well. And it was just the island with a little point in the middle coming down to the sea. And soon that was gone too, and it was just floating there above the surface. And eventually it just slowly faded away over a space of about 5-10 minutes or so. And that would have been the home of the Finn folk, Hildeland. But you have to be careful with them, as this next story will tell you. It's called How Tam Scott Lost His Sight. I know Yerker's fond of this one, so if you're listening, Yerker, this wee one's for you as well. Now, Tam Scott had a boat, and he used to run back and forth between his native island of Sandy and Kirkwall, or to any of the other islands. If anybody had anything they needed to be transferred, if you needed to ship something, then he was there with his boat to take you. Now, it was the time of the Lammas Fair in Kirkwall, so everybody was wanting to go to the fair. And it was well known that a lot of the girls getting on board the boat there had a cross painted on their chest by their mothers to protect them from the Finn folk, because the Finn folk can't stand the sign of the cross, and so they wouldn't be carried off by Finn folk. Well, they sailed into Kirkwall. The passengers went ashore and went through the town to go to the fair. The Lammas Fair was running, and it was a great, great thing. Everybody went to the fair, and everything imaginable was for sale, and there was also lovely food, and there was things to do, and there was games for the kids, and it was a real party atmosphere. And Tam was going around, and he was having a cog of ale as well, having a wee drink and enjoying himself, when a stranger came up to him and said, "Are you Tam Scott?" "Yes," he said, "I am." "I hear you have a boat for hire." "Yes, I do, yeah. "Well, I'm needing to hire it," says the man. Well, Tam looked at him. Now, he'd never seen him before in his life. He was a tall man with very black hair and a black moustache and beard, and a look to match. I mean, he was not a very happy-looking person. He was dour. He was dark by complexion, but he was dark in his character too. "I have a cow," he said, "that I want to take up to one of the North Isles. Will you ferry it for me? I'll pay you well. I'll pay you double, because I'm taking you away from the fair so soon." "Oh, yeah, fine," says Tam. "Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that, of course, yes. Right, I'll see you in an hour's time down at the pier." "Great, fine." So Tam went off to look for his pal that used to help him with the boat. But he found him lying sound asleep outside the vintners that was down at Anchor Building. And he was dead drunk, out for the count. So Tam gave him a wee kick and a big curse, and he headed down to get the boat ready himself. Well, at the appointed time, here comes the big dark man, leading this cow with him. And he's, Tam's starting to think now, well, how are we going to get this cow in the boat? But when they got down to the pier, when the man was opposite the boat, to Tam's amazement, he just picked the cow up like it was a lamb and jumped into the boat and set the cow down. "Wow," thought Tam. "Remind me not to get on the wrong side of this guy." So they cast off the rope and they hoisted a sail and they sailed off from Kirkwall Bay. And they were out the harbour, they were going up Kirkwall Bay and towards the island of Shappensea. And Tam says, "Where do you want to go? Do you want to go to Shappensea?" "East of Shappensea," says the man. So Tam's a sociable character. He's trying to engage a conversation with this guy. But the man just sits there dour, says not a word. And if he does speak at all, which is very seldom, he only said, "A safe tongue keeps a safe heed." A close tongue keeps a safe heed, I should say. A close tongue keeps a safe heed. So they go to the east of Shappensea and he goes, "You want to go to Stronsey?" "East of Stronsey." So again, he's trying to make conversation, but all he gets is, "A close tongue keeps a safe heed." Well, remembering the picking up the cow incident, he decides not to push his luck too far with this guy. So they go east of Stronsey, and he says, "You'll be wanting to put into Sandy then." "East of Sandy," he said. "You can't go east of Sandy." "Close tongue keeps a safe heed." "Look, there's nothing east of Sandy. There's Norway east of Sandy. This boat's not big enough to go to Norway." "A close tongue keeps a safe heed." Well, before he could do much more or argue any more with the man, they were sailing to the east of Sandy, when he could see something like a silvery cloud floating on the surface of the sea. And they head towards this cloud, and it gets swallowed up, and he says, "We'd better get back. We'd better try to get out of here. A close tongue keeps a safe heed." Well, a close tongue might keep a safe heed, but a fog won't keep us very safe if we get lost in this. I mean, we could end up who knows where. A close tongue keeps a safe heed. So they just keep on sailing in front of them, and they come out of this fog, and there's a green island in front of them. Now, he only sees a glimpse of this, because this strange man jumps forward to jumps to the stern of the boat where Tam's sitting, and says, "I have to blindfold you." Well, he wasn't going to argue, and sure enough, a blindfold is tied around his eyes. But the man doesn't make a very good job of tying it, and so there's a little gap underneath so Tam can see what's going on. And he sees a beautiful green island that he's never seen before. Now, he knows these waters, and there is not an island there, and he realizes now that this is a Finn man he has on board the boat. Not any mortal, but a Finn man. Now, as they get nearer, the mermaids who are sitting on the beach start to sing the most beautiful song. And it is so, so beautiful that Tam's heart just soars with it. It's gorgeous. It's wonderful. It's everything in the world that's good all rolled into one. But as they get near the shore, the Finn man just shouts at them, "Leave him alone, ye limmers. He's married and got a family back on the island of Sandy." Well, when the mermaids heard that, they start to weep and they sing another song, sing a tragic song that makes poor old Tam, the tears well up in his eyes. Next thing they know, the bottom of the boat grounds on the beach, and he can hear voices all around him, and many hands grab the boat and pull it up the beach. He can feel the cow being lifted up out the boat and set down on the gravel beach and stroll off. And then the boat is being pushed back down, and there's a chink. A bag of coins is thrown into the boat, and the boat is pushed back into the sea. And you know what the Finn folk do? They push it against the sun. They push it widdershins against the course of the sun, which no Christian would ever do but the Finn folk. They're no Christian and they're no canny. So the next thing he knows, he pulls off the blindfold, but he's back in this fog again. He can't see a thing. But in no time at all, he comes out the fog, and there in front of him is the Bray of Wasser in Sandy. He's back home again. And he takes up the bag of coins that's in the bottom of the boat, and he opens it, and he's been paid well, right enough. But every coin is a copper coin. Because, you see, the Finn folk love the white money, as they call silver, and they love silver too much to part with so much as one coin. So he's all paid in coppers. But that was fine too. So a year passes, and Tam's back at the Lammas Fair again, and he's wandering about and he's having a cog of ale, and suddenly he sees the strange man. Now the strange man hasn't seen him, but Tam's seen him. And he goes over to him, and he taps him on the shoulder, and the man turns around with a scowl on his face. And Tam says, "It's good to see you again. Hey, how have you been? Would you like a cog of ale? Would you like to join me with that?" It's good to see you," he says. "What have you been doing since I seen you last?" "Did you ever see me?" said the man with a black look on his face. "Well, you'll never have to say that again." And he took a box out, which Tam thought was a little snuff box that he was going to offer him a pinch of snuff. And the Finn man opens the lid of it and blows some of the dust into Tam's eyes. It stings. The lights flash in his eyes, and then he opens them, and nothing. Just blackness. He never sees another thing for the rest of his days. Tam Scott is blind. So it's a very sad Tam that goes home that night, and life for him changes drastically. But you see, you shouldn't make too friendly with people that you don't know. And also, the Finn man was wise in his saying as well, because a close tongue does keep a safe head. Now, you all know the story about the Selkie woman who loses her skin and has to remain on land. Well, there are stories about Selkie men as well. Now, this story was set in the island of Stronsey. A long time ago, there was a laird who lived there, and he had a daughter called Ursula Balfour. and he was trying to marry her off to another laird's son. His thinking was that if the families were united, then their grandchildren would inherit a much bigger estate. He was always looking for a laird who owned land next to his own. Now, Ursula was not the sort of girl that would be pushed around. She was a very strong-willed, very determined young woman, and there was no way she was marrying whatever chinless wonder her dad dragged into the home. And she had plenty of suitors, and she found plenty of fault with them, and she left them in no doubt what she thought of them. They were sent packing with a flea in their ear, and they were not happy, and neither were their fathers as well. But she was determined that there was no way that she was going to marry just anyone. Now, the thing is, Ursula was actually already in love. But the man that she was in love with was not suitable for a laird's daughter. He was the man that worked in her father's barn. He minded the kiln, he thrashed barley, he was a common peasant. Now, that was never going to be a match that would suit her father, and he would never agree to it, and he would disinherit her. She would be kicked out without a penny. And being the only child, she stood to inherit everything, so she bided her time. And she kept it secret by being really horrible to the poor young man. She would go down to the barn and she would find fault with everything and criticize him. And he just, every time he saw her coming, his heart sank, while her heart soared at the sight of him. But one day, Ursula's luck changed, and her father died. And that was a good result for her, because it meant that she now inherited the whole estate, and she didn't have to worry about who she was going to marry, or she could choose for herself. And the first thing she did, once she made sure that everything was done legally and that there was no way that she could lose the land and the money, she went down to the barn and she told the barman to go up to his home and to wash and get himself dressed and have a shave and come back to the big house because he was going to be married. Married? He said. Who am I marrying? You're marrying me, of course. Don't you know that I love you? She said. No, I can't say that I did, he said. But she ordered him to go and get washed, and he didn't argue with Ursula. So away he went to his home with a heavy heart. And he washed and he shaved and he put on his best suit and he went back down to the big house. Well, the two of them were married. And he had no choice in the matter. I mean, she was the laird now. She could throw him out of his home if she took the notion to. And maybe if she really wanted to hurt him even more, she could throw out his whole family. So there was nothing for it but just to agree. And so he married her. Now, time passed, and it soon became clear to Ursula that he didn't love her. In fact, he didn't really even like her very much. And the marriage bed was a cold and lonely place. Now, she was a strong-willed woman, and she had decided that she would take a lover. She had made a poor match with this man. He didn't love her. She hadn't thought of that. But she decided that she would find a lover from somewhere. But where? You see, she couldn't take a lover from among her own class, from among the lairds, because she'd already sent all the lairds' sons packing with a flea in their ear. And if she took a lover from among the peasantry, well, the scandal if that ever got out. And all the laird's sons, they were all scoffing at her, and this marriage she'd made and saying it'll not last 6 months, and poor Ursula decided anyway that she wanted a lover. She wanted comfort. She wanted warmth. And so she made up her mind what to do. And one night she went down to the shore and she knelt on a rock and she shed 7 tears into the sea. They said it was the only tears that she'd ever shed in her life. But as the ripple of the last tear spread across the surface of the water, a head rose up from the sea, a seal's head. And the seal pulled away the skin from its face, and there underneath was a handsome young man. He looked at Ursula and he said, "Why have you called me, fair maiden?" "Well," she said, "I've made a poor marriage, and the marriage bed is a cold and lonely place, and I want to feel strong arms around me. I want to feel warmth, and I want passion." "Ah, so you've come to the Selkie folk, then," said the seal. "I have." "Well," he says, "I can give you everything that you want, but there is only one provision. I can only come ashore at certain times of the tide, so you'll have to wait until the spring tide. And once the spring tide, you can come down to the shore, and I can come out of the sea, and I can give you everything that you want." She agreed, and the seal pulled the skin back over its face and became a seal again and dived down into the depths of the water. Well, that was fine. Soon, at the next spring tide, she went down to the shore, and there was the seal man, and he took her in his arms, and she knew what love was. She knew what passion was, and she liked it. Now, after this had happened a few times, the servants started to notice, that Ursula was putting on a bit of weight, especially around the belly. And soon it became obvious that there was more than one heart beating in Ursula Balfour's body. And everybody speculated, well, who could this bairn be? Who was the father? Certainly not her husband. So it was much speculated on, but no one knew. But when the time came, she gave birth to a beautiful little baby boy with big brown eyes, and between every finger and every toe was a web of skin. Ha! Didn't that tell a tale? Well, the old nurse that Ursula had, who was taking care of the child, used to snip away these webs of skin between the fingers and the toes, but they kept growing back again, and she kept snipping them and they kept growing. But eventually, after she'd kept cutting them, when skin wasn't allowed to grow in its natural place, it spread onto the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet and became a thick, hard crust. They call it hard hand. And they say that if you scratch it, it has a faint, fishy smell with it. And to this day, in the island of Stronsay, it is said that there are still people that have this skin condition. And they are the descendants of Ursula Balfour and her Selkie lover. Now, I once told that story in Stronsay, and then I looked at the audience closely, and some of them were nudging each other, going, oh. So maybe there's a few of them still around to this day, yeah?